Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with parapsychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to take a speculative look at ancient Atlantis. My guest is Dr. Angela Thompson Smith. She is a remote viewer who trained with both Paul Smith and Lynn Buchanan, both of whom have been interviewed on this channel, and she is a founding member and director of the International Remote Viewing Association. She is the author of Diary of an Abduction, a scientist probes the enigma of her alien contact. Voices from the Cosmos, co-authored with C.B. Scott Jones. Seer, 30 Years of Remote Viewing. Tactical Remote Viewing, which is the book upon which today's interview will be based, but also Remote Perceptions, Out-of-Body Experiences, Remote Viewing, and Other Normal Abilities. As I mentioned initially, this is a speculative interview, but I could think of no one better to engage in a highly speculative interview focusing on remote viewing abilities than Dr. Angela Thompson Smith. Once again, this is an internet interview, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Angela. I'm very glad to be with you once again.
And I'm very happy to be here again.
So we're going to focus today on the work you did looking at ancient Atlantis. And in some ways, this is sort of a project I would regard it as parallel to our previous discussion about looking at alien entities who could communicate with you telepathically.
Fairly similarly, in that it was tasked by the same client. What I found, though, with the Atlantis project was that these were very real humans that I was interacting with.
I guess we're talking about retrocognition, since, in effect, you're communicating with beings who presumably were alive on the planet tens of thousands of years ago.
Yeah, right, yeah. Retrocognition and retro-telepathy, a lot of looking back at history.
Just as with the voices from the cosmos, there's an element of speculation because it's very difficult, almost impossible to get physical, empirical confirmation of the information that comes through.
Absolutely. And as I said before with many of my other projects, I approach them with some skepticism, with some caution, and I try and keep my own biases out of the picture and understand that there's very little feedback to be had. However, information that we can get from the past can assist us now in the future. And my client was very interested in alternative healing, alternative technology. So some of the information that I was able to access in this group of projects was very helpful to him.
I gather one of his interests was the question of longevity, that presumably people in ancient times lived longer.
Right. And looking at, after I had done the projects, I amassed a large collection of literature. And going back through some of that literature was confirming in some aspects. Some of it didn't match at all, and most of it didn't match at all. But I was able to find some confirmations on ages and dates and potential dates, because nobody really knows when. But there was also some work from, I believe it was Plato, that talked about, the early Atlantis times from their history.
Well, as a matter of fact, I did do an earlier interview with Jason Reza Georgiani looking at philosophers who have written about ancient Atlantis. They include Rudolf Steiner, Colin Wilson, and of course Plato. So I'm going to link to that interview for viewers who are interested. There'll be a hot link right now in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. But in addition to the philosophical writings concerning Atlantis, there are also a history of clairvoyants who have written about it. And I suppose Rudolf Steiner, the philosopher, fits into both categories.
There is a huge database. In fact, as I'd mentioned to you, I have put together an Excel file of written resources that I'm willing to share. And
since you mentioned it, we'll link to that as well right now, once again, in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If you'd like to download the Excel file with resources concerning ancient Atlantis, there will be a hot link there for you, and it will also be in the description that you can find if you scroll down beneath the YouTube video to the description. The hot link will be there as well.
That would be great. Thank you.
So, concerning ancient Atlantis, you entered into a state of consciousness where you felt you could enter into telepathic communication with someone who lived there to ask them questions.
It was a little bit of several different methodologies. The main methodology I used was extended remote viewing, which is an altered state, streaming, access to information, as well as OBE, out-of-body experience, because I had out-of-body experiences since I was a child, so I will use those or that ability from time to time. So in this project in the Atlantis, well, there are a series of projects. I used a more natural remote viewing rather than the strict military controlled remote viewing or coordinate remote viewing.
I am assuming that just like the project you did communicating with alien intelligences, there was a sense that you were really communicating with someone, that this was not just imagery from your subconscious imagination.
It really felt that way because the very first project, I was asked to contact 3 individuals in Atlantis, first of all, just to sort of ground myself in the project, in the experience. And I found 3 individuals that I was able to contact of differing classes, because it seems that Atlantis was comprised, it was a very class society, ranging from the fishermen to the sailors to the right up to the elite. And they lived on various aspects, and it was a series of islands that I perceived rather than the discrete rings that have been portrayed by artists. So these were rings of islands rather than joined together islands with bridges. So the folks who were on the lower end of the scale, the fishermen and the farmers, were on the outer islands, and the elite lived right in the center. And that's where I found 3 individuals that I was able to have almost, it was a telepathic in a way, if these were individuals, because I can't prove that. But there was definitely a contact with some information from the past, which showed itself to me as 3 distinct individuals.
As I recall, there was even a sense of personality there, like one individual felt a little impatient waiting to talk to you while you were busy conversing with one of the others.
Right, that surprised me because I thought I was talking to 3 individuals at discrete times, unknown to the others, but that wasn't the case. That surprised me.
You started out with a woman who was engaged in farming.
Right, a very simple but very intelligent woman. And she told me a little bit about the divisions. I would have to talk to this other person if I needed more information, for example. A very likable person, and very down to earth. I don't know. I suppose you could think back to the peasants of Europe. Very homespun, very down to earth, very practical people, and she was too.
And then the second encounter was with was it a fisherman or some other worker?
He was more of a worker, and he sort of chastised me for talking with the woman because it seems that they did not socialize with each other. And he was a little on the abrupt side, and I was able to glean quite a bit of information from him. But it was more work, talking to him than it was to the woman, Freya.
And the third person you describe as an elder.
Yeah, there was a very high class of Atlanteans who were the elders, the ones that lived for an incredibly long life. And they lived a very, very pampered life. They didn't work. They, in fact, some of them were even carried around because, one thing was they were very old and very disabled at the end. But they were, the one I talked, I believe this was a woman, and because women were the matriarchs, and there were patriarchs too, but the matriarch was basically a matriarchal system. And she talked to me, but in a friendly but almost a condescending manner, wanting to know who I was. So it was interesting talking to all three of them because there were different aspects of society that came through.
As I recall, one of the points she made that is, even though her body was so frail, she had to be carried around everywhere, she devoted herself to the cultivation of the mind.
Yes, yeah. That sounds like a wonderful way to be. If you're going to live to a long life, get carried around and just meditate. Yeah.
And in addition, you write about a conversation actually with Plato himself about Atlantis.
At the very end, just for fun, I thought, okay, if I can contact these other folks, let me see if I can contact Plato. And he was actually deceased, but I was able to talk, I imagine, to the spirit of Plato rather than to him when he was living. And he was really not very happy with me talking to him, but he gave me some information about what he had perceived. And at the end, he was like, well, just leave a tired old man to sleep, So he seemed a very real character.
I suppose another way of looking at what you're doing, some people would say you're accessing the Akashic records, the records of everything that's ever happened.
That's a metaphor for all the information that ever has been, is, and will be, similar to what we call the matrix in remote viewing, that there is a repository of information that can be accessed and through various methods. So that's true. That was, it could be said I was accessing the Akashic record or the Akashic library.
You know, some people might look at this through a spiritualist lens. Other people might suggest it's the Akashic records, or my friend Marty Rosenblatt would say the universe of collective consciousness.
Yeah, it's called by many names.
Now, you mentioned that Atlantis, as you experienced it in this process, had classes, social classes that were quite distinct. You also write that there were different historical periods. It wasn't simply a uniform society from age to age. It lasted for, I think, tens of thousands of years, and there were, you might say, different epochs.
Right. And I didn't have the time or the resources to go into every epoch, but I did go backwards and forwards. For example, my client was very interested in the the rituals that were performed on Atlantis. So at one point, I went to a location where it was a temple where there were roaming bulls, a bit like the Mithraic religions, and the individuals who were there serving in the temple were hunting the bulls, and the bulls were hunting them. So that was quite dramatic, and I am very much an animal lover, so that was not my choice. It was where I ended up. I asked to see a ritual, and that's what I perceived.
And you also wrote about the technology that they had. There was a primitive society, but they seemed to be able to work with, I think, what you describe as earth energies.
Absolutely. And that was fascinating because I'd always heard about them using copper and crystals, but I didn't understand that they were used in combination. So they would drive these large copper spikes way down into the earth. And they were also connected with crystals. And they would draw up the energy from the earth. But they had to ground it. For example, when rainwater came in, that could often disturb the energy. And that had to be siphoned off and back into the ocean, because that could disable the system. So there were, even back then, there was technology that they had to consider.
One of the interesting things that you wrote about also had to do with the social classes, that apparently the working class lifespan was shorter because they worked so hard. The elites seem to have a very prolonged lifespan. I think you suggest maybe over 200 years.
Right, incredibly long lives. But there again, we don't know how they divided up their year, or what they termed years. It could have been that a month to them could have been a year, or 6 months could have been a year in their vocabulary. That I wasn't able to ascertain, but they did seem to be able to live for an incredibly long life.
You also described that they had ships. They were navigating the oceans. They visited other lands. They engaged in trade.
What they did was they had a keel on the ship that was made of copper. And this also was able to gather in some of the energy from the salt water, because the energy was, when the rainwater was siphoned back into the ocean, that, of course, took it back in for, I suppose, a regeneration. And the mariners utilized that energy. And they did have some sails for when they needed perhaps to be near the shore or in fresh water. But when they were in the sea, they did use these keels and used the energy from the keels to direct the ships.
There are some myths about Atlantis that suggest that they were a highly advanced technological civilization that destroyed themselves. I gather your readings didn't confirm that.
Well, yes and no in terms of the technology. They were, apart from the elite at the top, they lived very simple lives and very contemplative lives. And I didn't remote view when it was destroyed. I did go to locations where the Atlanteans could possibly have landed when they took off in their ships, because that was the information that I perceived. And it seems I did some research after the fact of the west coast of Europe. So in terms of Scotland, Wales, Ireland, all around the Pyrenean area of the continent, there are some very, very interesting and unusual people and languages and customs, and they are right in a direct line with what would have been a migration coming in from the sea along that long coast. So it's quite possible that the Atlanteans landed on the west coast of Europe, perhaps even further south, we don't know. But for example, the Welsh language is very, very different from any other language in Europe. The Scots, the Gaelic is different, but they all have some similarities. While they're different in themselves, there are similarities between them, where they're very different from the other European languages. So there's also a period of time, and I think it was about 30,000 years ago, where I forget the actual dates, where out of the blue there appeared this civilization in Europe. Nobody knew where it came from. They came in with weapons, with energies, with language, with art, crafts that nobody had ever seen before. And when they do the archaeological research, there is nothing preceding this people that could account for them. So it's quite possible that they came in from Atlantis.
I think you're referring to what is known as, I believe it's called Aurignacian culture.
Right. Yes.
So there's quite a bit of archaeology that, for example, the various cave paintings in Europe, some of which are quite sophisticated, seem to be attributed to the Aurignacian culture.
Absolutely. There's some wonderful sculpture, and of course the cave paintings. And what I found, I did a National Geographic DNA search, which was from the maternal line. And I've done other ones since of my general DNA through Ancestry. I'm not advertising here. This is just what I did. And so with the National Geographic maternal line, I found that I was haplogroup H, which had its roots way back in the Aurignacian times, which really surprised me and delighted me, actually, because my own heritage came from way back through the maternal line.
And I gather that another word for the Aurignacian culture is also the Cro-Magnon culture.
I think so. I'm not too sure. Yeah.
Did you hypothesize where Atlantis was? I mean, for example, one of my other guests, Jason Georgiani, speculates that it's actually buried under the ice cap in Antarctica.
I've heard lots of stories about it. It was at the Canary Islands. It was north of the UK in the Dogger Bank. It was in the middle of the Atlantic. So I didn't do that. That wasn't part of, I was guided very much by the client's tasking. And that wasn't one of the taskings that he gave me to actually look at where it might be.
Some of the myths suggest they developed all sorts of technological powers and they destroyed themselves with their own technology as if it's a warning to us of what we might do. And I presume that's not what you found.
The main thing I found was that they had a climate change and they were getting more rain than normal. I didn't actually look at the cataclysm, but this was preceding. So there was a lot of rainwater coming in and both diffusing and making the energy that was coming up from the earth unstable. And they weren't able to drain off enough of the rainwater. And I think I speculated at the time that could have contributed to the demise. But there was a lot of consternation at the time about this situation.
Did you ever develop a sense about their religious practices?
From what I saw of the bulls being used very much in ceremony and ritual, both in reality as the animal itself and also as statues, that this was very much of a Mithraic religion. They were also very contemplative, and one of the taskings that the client gave me towards the end of our series was he was thinking of putting together a spa or a retreat site somewhere where he could bring in some of the Atlantis methodologies, practices, etc. So what he asked me to do was to go to one of the Atlantis centers where they went for rejuvenation and for rest and relaxation. And it was fascinating to describe. They did very much, it was not technology as we know it, but they used the copper implanted into the earth in all of the beds, the seating. The pool was a copper-lined seawater pond. Everything that they used to sit or eat or talk was dug down into the earth through copper rods and crystal rods. And they also had a silence. There was a bit like a monastic order. As they came in, they gave in all of their belongings and their payment and everything else outside. When they went inside, they didn't speak. They were fed a nutritious food, but they didn't speak to anybody else, except in quiet conversations where they could go into secluded rooms, also into dream rooms, where they could dream and talk to a person about the dreams. But there was no chatter. There was no, if you go to a spa today or a retreat site, there's a lot of chatter going on. And that can be very distracting. But in this spa, which was mostly outdoors, of course, it was very, it was warm, a warm temperature, that they could very much just be for a period of time. And they didn't go, say, for a day or a week or a month. They went for as long as they needed. And they told people that they were going to this, this is what I perceived, that they were going to this center where they could go in and leave whenever they needed. But it was assumed that they would be there for a duration.
Many people suggest that the pyramids of Egypt and perhaps pyramids elsewhere really originated with the Atlantean culture. There are some Egyptologists who wonder how the Egyptian culture seemed to emerge so suddenly. Now, I know you've also done readings on ancient Egypt. You've looked at the Sphinx in particular, but from what I gather, you didn't see an Atlantean connection there. No. And I don't recall seeing pyramids on the Atlantis that I perceived. It was not flat, but it was, they were not huge buildings, such as the pyramids. So I think that was a completely separate civilization. How would you compare the results of your remote viewing with, let's say, the reports of Edgar Cayce, who is well known for having provided ostensible information about Atlantis?
I did look at a bit of that after the fact, because I didn't want to color my own perceptions beforehand. So, but afterwards, I went and looked, and I did find some overlap. But his viewings were more related to illness and disease, and how they were treated, and from the readings that I had. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to thank you for being with me once again, Angela. It's been a great pleasure.
You're welcome, and I'm happy to come and talk about much of the research that I've done and the explorations, and there will be more to come.
And for those of you watching, thank you for being with us.